Well, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to another of our Harif lockdown lectures. Harif, for those who are new to us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We're a group of volunteers, and we aim to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews. But of course, you don't have to be one to be interested in the subject. And if you're not on our mailing list already, I urge you to join it. You can subscribe at our website, which is www.harif.org. And do check out our sister website, Point of No Return, which deals with the news and information about Jews from Arab and Muslim countries. This evening is being recorded, and a video will be uploaded to our website and will be sent to you. The link will be sent to you in due course. If you have any questions for our speaker, you're welcome to type them in the chat box, and you will be able to ask them when our speaker has finished his presentation. The Jews in medieval Islamic Spain experienced an age of intellectual brilliance. Was it a golden age? Was there convivencia or coexistence between Jews and Muslims? Or is it a product of wishful thinking? To discuss this fascinating subject, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Noam Stillman, who is joining us from Jerusalem. Dr. Norman Stillman, emeritus professor and chair of Judaic History at the University of Oklahoma, specializes in the intersection of Jewish and Islamic culture and history, and in Oriental and Sephardi Jewry, with special interest in the Jewish communities of North Africa. His major publications are The Jews of Arab Lands, a History and Source Book, which we have here, and Sephardi Religious Responses to Modernity. In the last few years, Dr. Stillman has been the executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World, a project that includes over 2,000 entries in 5 volumes. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Stillman.
Thank you. And will I have you disable my screen? We had it up.
Sorry, we lost you for a few minutes, for a few seconds. Your screen froze.
There it is.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. Let's see. Excellent. Good evening, good afternoon, good day to everyone, and thank you to Lynn for inviting me to this wonderful program that she has been presenting. I wanted to talk today about a subject which is of particular interest to me because growing up, of course, in Jewish schools, and one always heard about the golden age of Spain. And to be quite honest, no civilization, I think, has been more romanticized than that certainly no medieval civilization, but no civilization period, I would go so far to say, as that of Islamic Spain. Let me just... In the 10th century, the German nun, Roswitha of Gandersheim, who probably never went more than a kilometer or so from the monastery in which she lived, wrote about Cordoba, the golden jewel of all the world, in one of her poems. And this, as you see, this romanticization goes back to the Middle Ages itself. Of course, you have the legends and the great epic poem El Cantar de Mio Cid, which, and I must say, at least I see most of the people who are taking part in this are old enough to know who was Charlton Heston and who was Sophia Loren. Very often when I cite this for students, they have the faintest notion who they are. But in any case, again, this was part of this romantic tradition concerning medieval Spain. The first great French epic, the Chanson de Roland, which of course also appears in paintings and so on, as you see here, again is set in medieval Spain. The great Gibbon, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, writes that if it weren't for the Battle of Tours-Poitiers, the muezzin would have been giving his call from the towers of Notre Dame. The German scholar von Ranke, the historian, called the turning back of the Spanish Muslims from going any further past the Pyrenees as the turning point of one of the most important epics in the history of Europe. In the 19th century, the novelist of American novelist Washington Irving wrote what was one of the first bestsellers in English internationally on tales of the Alhambra. Heinrich Heine had stories set in medieval Spain, and so on. And this went on and on. You had Turkish romantics. And of course, perhaps no one was more romantic about it than the founders of modern Jewish studies, the so-called Wissenschaft des Judentums school in Germany. People like Heinrich Gretz, Abraham Geiger, Leopold Zuntz, and Moritz Steinschneider. Again, growing up in a Jewish suburb of New York in the 1950s, every Jewish home had the English translation of Gretz's History of the Jews. And in it, for example, this period of the Jews in Spain takes up almost one whole volume. And in it, Gretz writes, and I quote him, "The Jewish inhabitants of this happy peninsula contributed by their hearty interest to the greatness of the country which they loved as only a fatherland can be loved." You can hear the yearnings of a 19th century German Jew in that. And then that may be perhaps wishful thinking, but in a later passage he wrote, "The cultured Jews of Andalusia spoke and wrote the language of the country as fluently as their Arab fellow citizens, who were as proud of their Jewish poets as the Jews themselves. This, of course, is not merely wishful thinking, it's absolute fantasy, because Jewish poets, as we will see, wrote almost, not exclusively, but almost exclusively in Hebrew, and Arab were not the least bit interested in that. In any case, just one more example of this romanticism comes in both popular and serious scholarly works. And there were two books in recent years which I want to mention to you, which it goes for this. One of them is Ornament of the World, which is by a professor of Spanish literature. Unfortunately, she passed away young, Maria Rosa Menocal from Yale, and she's taken the title from Hroswitha of Gandersheim's. Oops, there she is. A medieval poem, and this book talks about convivencia. Convivencia merely was a term that really meant living side by side. It didn't necessarily mean well or not well. It was coined by the Spanish historian Americo Castro, but she takes it in the romantic sense, that there was this bond that existed, and the book came out just after 9/11 and had a new introduction added to it, to say that there was a time when the Islamic world and the rest of the world were not as we have it now. I would just point out that sometimes this kind of romanticism causes a sort of reaction. And recently, a book came out by Dario Fernandez Morera, a professor of Spanish in one of the American universities. And this one is called The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise. And basically, in this book, there was nothing good in medieval Spain. All right, that being said, maybe a spoiler, historians, of course, don't really believe that there ever was a golden age anywhere. But there are periods in history which were particularly brilliant, if you will, socially, economically, politically, and so forth. And certainly, Islamic Spain was one such period, and particularly for the Jews. And it was for that reason that it so inspired the German Jewish scholars of the 19th century, who were looking to integrate themselves into German culture, and saw Islamic Spain as the model which they could follow. They also held it up as a counterpoint to medieval Jewish history in Christian Europe, with crusades and pogroms and so on and so forth. And so they had this strong romanticizing spirit. And by the way, it continued even with Jewish historians and scholars well into the 20th century. Raphael Patai, the anthropologist and historian, refers to Jews in Islamic Spain as the Camelot, Spain as the Camelot of the Muslim world. Now, there's no doubt about it that the Jewish experience in Spain was in many ways sui generis for the Middle Ages. First of all, the Spain marked the very end of the Islamic conquests, which had begun a century, almost a century earlier. Jews living there in the under the Visigoth kings in the period just before the Muslim invasion had been suffering from persecution. They, as Christians and Jews, by the way, in the Middle East, in many places, welcomed in the Muslim invaders. So it seems the Jews of Spain did as well. But one of the things that makes it quite different is that, and we have Muslim historians who are writing in the century just after the Islamic conquest, the Muslim armies that invaded Spain were very small indeed. They were mostly made up of Berbers who had converted to Islam at first, and then later were joined by large numbers of Arabs as well. And the initial army that invaded Spain in 711 was a very small army, maybe 7,000 people at most. They defeated the Visigothic king Roderick at the famous battle of Lago de la Janda, and he was killed. And at that point, the whole Iberian Peninsula lay open to them. But they had so few people, according to the Muslim historians, in city after city they would leave local Jews in charge of garrisons to keep the cities while they moved on with the conquest elsewhere. This, we have no other examples of this from Islamic history and the Middle East. We have one case in the Islamic conquest of the Middle East where a Jew in the city of Caesarea in the land of Israel shows the invading Arabs a hidden passageway to get into the city, but never do we have cases of the local Jews or Christians actually making common cause or serving the Muslim conquerors in this way. So that already makes Spain, the case of Spain, quite different. Now, that being said, for the next 200 years, Jews seem to be very quiet in Spain. We don't hear much about them, but they seem to have. You do know, since this course, you've dealt with the Jews of the Islamic world before, you know that the Islamic world, by medieval standards, was relatively tolerant. Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians were considered people of the book, people who had a valid, albeit inferior, brand of religion. And generally, as long as they paid their taxes and the comportment of a minority population, they were to be allowed freedom of religion, freedom of economic endeavor, and the internal autonomy to run their own schools, their courts, and so on. Again, by medieval standards, this was relatively tolerant. In any case, we can see that from the sources that Jews moved around Spain relatively freely during the Muslim period. I would just point out the Muslims never conquered the entire country, but rather this huge area, which actually is both Portugal today and Spain. For convenience, we always call it Islamic Spain, but I must say that I was at a conference once in Toledo years ago, in 1992 actually, and the Spaniards, the French, the Israelis, the Americans, we always kept referring to Islamic Spain, until one of the Portuguese speakers said, but you do know, it wasn't just Spain, but of course it was called Hispania, and that's how it comes about. But in any case, Jews moved around this country rather freely. In 785, Pope Hadrian sends a letter to the Spanish bishops asking them to take action against what he considered undue Jewish influence on the Christian flock. Apparently, there were groups of what we would call today proto-Protestants. That is, people who had read parts of the Bible and adopted practices which the Roman Catholic Church referred to as Judaizing. In any case, they seem to have been able to move around without much difficulty. But we don't see them as courtiers and as major figures that we'll see in another century and a half. But at this time, we also see another example of Jewish influence in Spain. A chaplain at Louis the Pious's court up in Europe has a vision, as people did in the Middle Ages, where he thinks the end of time is approaching. He wants to go back to the original religion, which of course Judaism. He gets permission to go on a pilgrimage. As you know, you have the great Pilgrim's Way from Europe into Santiago de Compostela, Santiago being the heavenly twin of Jesus in Spanish mythology at the time. And he comes to Spain, converts to Judaism, offers his entourage to do the same. They don't. He sells them into slavery. And he then wages a polemical war against Christianity. Christian sources say that he actually served in the Muslim military. His name was Bodo, and he took on the name Eleazar. And Bodo Eleazar writes this famous polemic against Christianity. In any case, we see that although Jews are keeping a low profile, they seem to have a great deal of free intercourse with other members of the population. All of this changes in a dramatic fashion, and we begin to see the shining of what was many saw as the golden age of Spain in the 10th century, when the Muslim rulers of Spain declared themselves to be the caliphs. The rulers of Spain, the emirs of Spain, were descendants of or refugee descendants from the Umayyad house, which had ruled the Islamic Empire from 661 until 650 out of Damascus. They were replaced and, for the most part, exterminated by the Abbasids, who then built Baghdad and ruled from there. But one of their descendants makes it all the way to Spain and becomes the ruler in Cordoba, but calling himself simply the emir, not the caliph. But in 912, a young man by the name of Abdurrahman III, comes to rule, and he's able to reunite much of Spain, which has been divided from civil wars and so on. He declares a caliphate. And one of the things that he does, which has a tremendous effect on Jewish history in Spain, is that he has as his personal advisor his Jewish court physician. Let's go down. Here, by the way, is the great mosque of Cordoba, now, of course, the cathedral, which he built. With its famous forest of columns. And I would just point out, and here again, this is one of the things that gave feeling to the Golden Age. If any of you have ever been to Toledo, here is the synagogue now, and then a church. That's why it's Santa Maria la Blanca. But you see, it's a modest form of the same royal architecture as the Great Mosque itself. In any case, Abdurrahman had as his physician a Jew by the name of Hasdai ibn Shaprut. And Hasdai, as a physician, Jews, by the way, very often, court Jews in the Middle Ages, in the Islamic world, were either physicians or merchant suppliers to the court. And Hasdai, as a physician, and by the way, one of the things I should point out, in the Islamic world, physicians were trained in the Greek corpus of learning, and so you not only had a personal doctor, you also had a philosopher, a trained philosopher as your doctor. And Hasdai becomes not only a chief advisor to the emir, but he's a diplomat, a statesman. It's rather interesting how he, some of his great successes, one of them is that one of the kings in Christian Spain in the north suffered from obesity. He was young. He comes to the throne. He's only a teenager. He can't even stay on a horse very well. He falls asleep at meetings. And the nobles depose him. What does his mother do? She takes him down to Cordoba, looks for a good Jewish doctor, and by the way, we have this from both Muslim and Christian sources. He puts the young Sancho, the deposed king, on a diet, gets him back into shape, and then with the caliph sends back an army to put him back on the throne, and now he becomes a vassal of the caliph of Muslim Spain. So this was considered to be a great diplomatic achievement. Also, during this, another of his diplomatic achievements was Muslim pirates in the Mediterranean had sailed up the Rhone River and were causing all sorts of problems. The Holy Roman Emperor writes a letter to the Muslim Caliph of Spain. You've got to do something about this. He writes back an angry letter. You can't tell me what to do, you Christian, whatever. At this point, the Holy Roman Emperor decides something has to be done, and he's going to send a furious letter, also insulting Islam, to the Caliph in Spain. they had good secret services even then, so it was known what was in the letter. A monk volunteered to bring it, knowing that he would be, you didn't have diplomatic immunity in those days, that he would be put to death. He brings it to Cordova, and the caliph, not wanting to have a casus belli, asks Hasdai to do something. Hasdai entertains this monk named Johannes of Gorza for 6 months in his house. He finally talks him out of delivering the letter, getting a new one in its place. And we even have Johannes of Gorza's account of how grateful he is to Hasdai. So Hasdai now has become, if you will, the Henry Kissinger of Islamic Spain. He also was involved in, and here, by the way, this is the ruins of the royal city outside of Cordova, the palace of the caliph, and an artist's reconstruction of it. He also was asked by the caliph to make a translation of one of the classic works of Greek medicine, the De Materia Medica of, we see it over here, of Dioscorides. And so he was the leading Jewish figure in Islamic Spain in his day. And he sets the tone for what becomes the Sephardi courtier class, all the way from Islamic Spain to Christian Spain and to the Ottoman Empire and North Africa after 1492. And again, this helps to create this golden image of medieval Spain. Hasdai, for the first time, as a courtier, we have had other Jews who've served in Islamic courts in the Middle East, in the Fatimid court in Cairo, you had bankers at the caliph's court in Baghdad, but they didn't create an identity the way Hasdai does, and one which is held up by later Jews, Jewish writers, people like Ibn Daud in his Sefer HaKabbalah, the book of tradition, in which he talks about the founding of this elite class and Hasdai being the model. Hasdai, just like, it basically follows the pattern of Islamic courtiers. He has gatherings in his home where men of scholarship, poets, and others talk about their work. But the difference is, and this is the first time, with Hasdai, these are Jews. Hasdai has Jewish artisans, Jewish poets, Jewish thinkers speaking at his. It was called a moshav. In Arabic, it's called a majlis. And at his court attracted Jews from elsewhere, from North Africa as well, one of whom was the poet Dunash ben Labrat, who is the first person to make the innovation of writing Hebrew poetry according to the rules of Arabic rhyme and meter, and for the first time since the Bible, to write secular poetry about the good life, poetry about wine, women, nature. Most of you, those of you who know Jewish literature at all, on the Sabbath, one of the Sabbath hymns that's very popular, both with Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, is Deror Yikra. Deror Yikra leven imbat veryin tzorchem kamo vavat. Proclaim liberty to son and daughter. And this you can hear it rhymes, it has meter and so on. He wrote poems about wine. He wrote poems about love. Again, nothing like this existed before. This was, and again, you can understand now why the German Jewish scholars and later Jews in the Western world so admired this, because here were Jews who had assimilated elements of the surrounding culture, but had made it their own. And among the people in his circle, there was Menachem bin Saruk, who writes the first Hebrew dictionary. One other thing that Hasdai does is, and this is something we know also from Muslim sources, and that is that at this time, the Jews in the Islamic world were under the spiritual guidance of the Gaonim, who were in Babylonia, Iraq. He brings in, his caliph had already made the largest library in the Islamic world west of Baghdad, the Great Library of Cordova, some 400,000 books supposedly. And he brings in books from all over the Jewish world. He also establishes a center for Jewish studies in Cordova under a rabbi from Italy named Moses ben Hanoch. And one of the things that happens is Spain now becomes an independent center of Judaism. And we know that, and by the way, this we know not only from Jewish scholars like Ibn Daud, but we know it from correspondence in the Cairo Geniza, and we know it from Muslim writers, because Dunash was such a great physician that he makes it into one of the Muslims were very good Arabic writers in books of biographies of men of science, of men of literature, of men of government, and so on. And in a book of men of science, there is a biography of Dunash, and it says that it credits him with making Spain independent from the great yeshivot of Baghdad. But all of this really is a very short period of time. Hasdai dies in the 980s. The caliphate comes to an end in the 890s. The caliphate comes to an end, and Spain breaks up into a civil war, which basically tears the country apart. And in 1009, Muslim Spain breaks up into, by the way, just you have this of the Dioscorides, which he translates into Arabic, and there is a medieval Islamic library. In the Geniza, we actually have, just in passing, this is a poem. Dunash falls out of favor with Hasdai, gets exiled back to Morocco, and his wife writes this poem on how much she misses him. and we actually have it preserved in the Cairo Geniza. Spain breaks up into these petty principalities. They're called the Taifa kingdoms, the Molucca Tawaif, the Reyes de Taifas in Spanish. They're called the party kingdoms. Some are ruled by Berbers, some are ruled by Arabs, some are ruled by committees of religious scholars. And what happens here is that during this period, and they're all fighting one another, and they're all fighting the Spanish kingdoms in the north, but these little principalities become very much, in a way, similar to the situation we had in Renaissance Europe, in Renaissance Italy in particular. That is, each little local court tried to outshine the other. And this gave opportunities to Jews to rise to positions like Hasdai. This is something you would not see in the Middle East. You would have a few Jews who would become important, but very, very few. They tended to have low profiles, in part because under Islamic law, non-Muslims are not to have authority over Muslims. But in these petty kingdoms, Jews could rise like Hasdai to some of the highest positions at court. And perhaps none had a higher position than over here in Granada than Samuel ibn Nagraila, known as Shmuel Hanagid, Samuel Hanagid. He becomes the vizier. They use the term secretary, katib, to the king, the Berber king of Granada. He leads armies in the field. He has a court which he has poets, scholars, and so on. Again, Jewish poets and scholars come, and he himself is one of the great medieval. He's one of the great medieval Hebrew poets. And again, this must have to the Jewish scholars of Europe like Gretz and Steinschneider and so on. This was the consummation that they so devoutly wished for themselves, or for at least for other Jews. This, remember I said this is 1009. It all comes to an end in 1090 when the Almoravids come out of North Africa and put an end to these petty kingdoms. But for Jews, for this Jewish elite, and by the way, I would point out that they create an image of themselves. They say that their Hebrew is the best Hebrew because they are the descendants of the exiles from the first temple. They create this whole image of what a Jewish leader, scholar, and public figure should be. And Samuel Hanagid had the good fortune to die in bed. Most, of course, public figures were not so fortunate. He is believed by the historian Samuel Bargabor to be the builder of what is the core of the Alhambra Palace in Cordova. In Granada. as you know, if any of you who've been there know, it's a complex. It's not a single building. He builds this huge palace, which is taken over by his son and successor Joseph Hanagid in 1066, and Bargabor actually identifies it as originally a Jewish palace on two major things. One of this is the famous Court of the Lions, this lion fountain, which is unusual in Andalusian Islamic art, and he takes that to be a symbol for the Lion of Judah. I'm not an art historian, but I must say it certainly tickles one's fancy. But also, as you notice, there's the inscriptions all around. Of course, most of these are arabesques around the architecture. And in one of the rooms of one of the sections of the early part of the palace, when they were working on it, they found that there were Hebrew inscriptions and poetry by Samuel Hanagid. And that, by the way, if you're interested, Bargabor has an entire book on it, in which he presents his thesis. This all comes to a very dramatic and violent end in 1056. Samuel Hanagid dies. 1066, his son Joseph is killed in an uprising that starts with, among other things, a whole propaganda campaign against these Jewish nobles. There's a poem, I'm not pushing my book, but in Jews of Arab Lands, I have the poem by this Arab poet who writes to the king, and he says, "Look, these Jews, he's built a palace that oversees even yours." He describes the Jews as rats that, to use his words, munch and crunch, and they walk around in beautiful garments when they should be picking rags in the street, and so on. In any case, this propaganda campaign ends up with Joseph Hanagid being killed on the Sabbath at dinner in his palace. He's crucified on the city gates. By the way, in Islam, in the Muslim world, you have crucifixion, but it's after someone has been killed. They then are crucified on gates. We had it in Egypt just a few years ago, in fact, in Cairo, during the disorders. In any case, after this, we really don't have this brilliant class of Jewish courtiers in what's left of Islamic Spain. The new rulers of Spain are the Berber Almoravids, who come out of Morocco to help they were originally invited in by the princes of these various principalities, and then they become the man who came for dinner. They turn back the Christians for the time being, but they then take over Spain themselves. And they were these Almoravids, the Morabitun, who were known as the veiled men, because like the Tuareg Berbers, they wore veils. Although earlier Jewish historians said that they persecuted the Jews, they didn't really. They put in much stricter Islamic legal law, but but there are still some Jews who serve in court as doctors and so on. But basically, this golden age, which, if you want to call it that, which begins with Hasdai, ends already with the death of Joseph Hanagid. And then this is followed by the coming of the Almohads in the beginning in the 11th century, the end of the 11th century, and beginning of the 12th century. And they are a sectarian group of Muslims, and they, Islam says that Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, because they have valid, albeit no longer perfect religions, have the right to all these freedoms as long as they pay their taxes and so on. But the Almohads, being sectarians, said no, they had to convert to Islam or perish. And there was this is the first time in Jewish history that we have a crypto-Jewish movement of Jews who convert to Islam but continue to practice Judaism in secret. The Maimonides family being among them, and in a sense, this was the end of this golden age. It continues, if you will, to some extent in the Christian kingdoms of the north, and in some of these refugees make it all the way to the Middle East as well, like the Maimonides family. By the way, the Maimonides and his father write these epistles of comfort to the Jews, because a European rabbi whose name is unknown to us, has not been preserved, said the Jews of Spain and North Africa have lost their place in the world to come, because the three no's, one of which is idolatry. And Maimonides and his father in these epistles argue Islam is not idolatry. And of course, by the way, Christianity in North Africa disappears, never comes back. Judaism, on the other hand, Jews who converted to Islam but practiced Judaism in secret do return to Judaism several generations later. But in any case, we could say that the Jewish experience in Islamic Spain may not have been a golden age, but it certainly was one which for a short period of time did have brilliance. And that, I think at this point, leave it open to questions if there are any.
Okay, well, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, Noam. Let's have a look at the question.
Okay, Anne and Michael Crook, a few questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Noam. Very interesting. Two questions. Do you have any idea what sort of proportion of the population the Jews constituted at any point, at any time, or in any particular place? Was it a very small percentage, or?
No, it actually. But I would just quickly add. We have echoes. I would add that the population figures for pre-modern times are only guesstimates. However, there are good guesstimates for Jewish population figures in medieval Spain, or at least ones which I find convincing. There's a Spanish archaeologist who, on the basis of his explorations of the ruins of the Islamic cities in Spain. It comes to various population. Not everybody agrees with this, but in any case, in the major cities such as Cordoba and Granada and elsewhere, Jews were anywhere from 15% to perhaps a quarter of the population. And there were towns in Spain which, at least according to the Jewish sources, were overwhelmingly Jewish. This does not seem unreasonable. Just to be honest with you, I wrote an article for somebody's Festschrift not long ago, and one of the editors with the was questioning the population estimates, and I simply said, look, take a look at these estimates. And by the way, Eliyahu Ashtor, the great Israeli historian of medieval Islamic Spain, also made use of these estimates. And again, there are no numbers; they're only percentages. And so I find that that the argument is worth it. In the case of the Middle East, some of the estimates were way too high, and now, based on the Geniza, say for Cairo and elsewhere, they were lowered. But Spain had a much smaller population period, and therefore, as I said, the 12 to 25% in major cities is not is far-fetched as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, Etty, you had a question next. You've remuted yourself. Etty?
Yeah, how can you compare Chasdai ben Shaprut to Maimonides?
Very simple. Of course, they're both physicians. They both are community leaders, but Chasdai ben Shaprut was not a Jewish scholar. He surrounded himself with Jewish scholars, Jewish men of letters, and so on. Actually, Chasdai, other than his translation of Dioscorides, which he did together with a Byzantine priest who was sent over by the Byzantine emperor at the request of the Caliph of Spain, of Abdurrahman, to help him make this translation. But nevertheless, Maimonides, I mean, mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe.
That's it.
So Maimonides was, Chasdai certainly was a fine physician. He supposedly rediscovered the miracle anti-poison, Greek anti-poison drug, but Maimonides was a great scholar of Jewish law. He was a commentator to the Mishnah, as well as the writer, of course, of the Yad Hazakah, the Mishnah Torah, the first major law code, Jewish law code. Maimonides wrote a dictionary of drugs, which we have, and he wrote essays on the widest variety of medical topics. I would point out on how to keep fit. He has one on sexual relations, which he wrote at the request of the ruler of Egypt. So, I mean, Maimonides is in a different class entirely.
Different class. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Okay, Emil.
Thank you.
Right. I would like to find out, was there any competition as such between the Spanish Jews and the exilarchs or the Ga'anim in Babylon?
We have in the Geniza a letter from one of the Gaonim. What is it with these Spaniards that they have stopped sending us queries for responsa? Up until Hasdai, Jews in Spain, like Jews throughout the Islamic world, wrote their questions, which were sent annually to the academies of Sura and Pumbedita. Most of them, they seem to have been. They also had connections with the yeshiva of Jerusalem as well. But that all comes to an end with Hasdai, and some scholars have questioned whether he really did this. But as I said, we know from Islamic sources, we know it from Jewish sources, and we know it. We have this letter from the Geniza saying, "What is it with them?" In the case of Samuel Hanagid, he does correspond with the Gaonim in Baghdad. They're no longer sitting in Sura and Pumbedita. The schools keep the name, but they've moved to Baghdad. But as far as we can see, they're no longer sending. They also send contributions, but they no longer are dependent upon them for their religious leadership. Whereas in an earlier stage, for example, the earliest version of the Sidur, even before Saadia Gaon's Sidur in the 9th century, is the Seder Rav Amram Gaon, which is the Jews in Spain sent a query to keep their religious services within halachic bounds, and he sends a sort of rough guide, the Seder Rav Amram, to them. We have other Jewish leaders who write in the century leading up to Hasdai, but after that, no, they no longer are turning to them for religious guidance. By the way, that's also partially what's going on in the other parts of the Islamic world. In North Africa, Kairouan, in what's today Tunisia, then called Ifriqiya, becomes a great Jewish center as well, and they still correspond with the Gaonim, not so from Spain, as they do become. And this perhaps was also part. Remember, Hasdai serves the ruler who breaks away from the caliphate completely and calls himself the caliph, and makes Spain this great independent Islamic center. And this seems to be part and parcel with that policy.
Okay, Ruth and John next.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. How involved were the Jews in Spain in the translation movement from Greek classics through Arabic to Latin in Europe?
That Jews were very involved in it, but that all took place in Christian Spain for a long time, as the Christians are pushing down with the Reconquista, and they for the first century and a half of the Reconquista, Christian Spain is a lot more tolerant and open-minded than the Spain we think of later on. And it's in Toledo, under the translation school, that the great works in Arabic, which already had been translated from Greek via Syriac, Aramaic, in Baghdad back in the 9th and 10th centuries, that now Jews and Christians very often, and the Christians are very often former Jews or former Muslims who know Arabic well, and they are performing these translations. And there's again, I mentioned the Wissenschafts des Judentums school. All these great scholars in the German-speaking lands in the 19th century, who are the founders of what we call Jewish studies or Judaic studies today. And Steinschneider, who was one of them, wrote a classic work, an enormous work called Die Hebräische Übersetzung im Mittelalters. Und der Juden als Dolmetschers. And you'll have to forgive my German. It's not very good. When I was a visiting professor in Germany, I lectured in English, but I sometimes spoke also in Yiddish, my childhood language. And students would tell me, yes, that's understandable. And sometimes they would say, it's not understandable. But in any case, there is a classic work on Jewish translation in Spain, but it was done after the conquest of Toledo, which was in 1061, if I recall rightly.
Would you say that the Christians actually have taken a bad rap, really, that Islamic Spain has taken all the credit for this intellectual brilliance, including this translators school?
Yes. The difference is of course that Christian Spain, as I said, started off rather tolerant, looking. In fact, what was the architecture that all these Christian kings admired so much? It was the Islamic architecture, and there is a style that became popular, which imitates the Andalusian style of architecture. The Jews in Christian Spain, but I mean this is not my specialty, but the Jews in Christian Spain, and this is one of the things that I have written about, is this: they maintained the ideals of the Jewish upper class of Islamic Spain. And this comes all the way down to the present time. You can see it in Morocco today. The king's closest advisor, Andre Azoulay, and before him, a number of others. And the great Italian traveler, Samuel Romanelli, who's stuck in Morocco. He's one of the first great Hebrew writers of the Haskalah. He writes this wonderful book, which I might add, I and my late wife translated to English, and was the runner-up for the best translated book in the United States in 1989. In this book, Travail in an Arab Land, he talks about the chief Jewish courtier of the Sultan of Morocco, and he talks about he could speak excellent Spanish, not Judeo-Spanish, but Castilian. And it's that same pride of language, blood, ancestry, and so on, which becomes the hallmark of the Sephardi courtier class, whether they're in Istanbul, whether they are in Damascus, whether they are in Cairo, Tunis, Algiers, or Fez, Marrakesh, and so on. And this was maintained all the way up to modern times. And it was also the humanism. Just give you one example. We have the curriculum of Jewish studies from Jewish Spain in the 12th century. And it starts off with Hebrew Bible, etc. But then it goes to poetry, prosody, mathematics, and so on, and science, and so on and so forth. And this curriculum was part and part. I remember one year when I'm having on sabbatical in Jerusalem, my neighbor downstairs was the great Rav Masas from Meknes, who was at that time the head of the Bet Din of Jerusalem, and he invited us to his Shabbat table one Friday evening, and we're singing piyutim, liturgical poems, and one beautiful poem I didn't recognize, and I asked him, I said, whose was that? I don't know it. He said, oh, I wrote it. That is part of that cultural creation that starts with Hasdai.
Okay, Dori, I think there's a
Yeah,
question
there's a
next.
question from Dori Schmetterling. I think you're unmuted, Dori.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, this is Dori Schmetterling. I'm actually in London. Noam, can I say that I, as a German speaker, can say that your accent, your pronunciation of German is very good, especially your R's in the back of the throat. Excellent. Anyway, my questions are, or my points are, I was surprised to learn that Zoroastrians existed in Spain. Of course, they're from Iran. Do you have any estimates how big this community might have been? As a percentage is fine. And how did they get to Spain? Just to add, were there any interactions with Jews? That's point one. Should I ask my second question at the same time?
Go on.
How come Yehuda Halevi doesn't get a mention in your talk? Thanks.
It's simply my trying to keep within the time limits.
Yeah. Sorry, and
and
Ibn Gabirol as well.
And I am a great fan of Judah Halevi's, all I can, you know what? If ever Lynn asks me to do this again, maybe I'll do one just on Judah Halevi.
That would be nice. Yeah.
And by the way, when I was a professor at Oklahoma and we were thinking of perhaps founding an Orthodox congregation, the name I wanted to give it was Livi v'Mizrach.
Oh,
right,
lovely. My heart is in the east.
Yeah,
yes,
was asking
because Vani B'Sof Ma'arav.
Jacqueline was asking about Judah Halevi, which I invited her to ask a question. So I don't know if you've got more questions to ask, Jacqueline.
Yeah, Jacqueline.
Well, it was about just a few other names that you didn't mention, but besides Judah Halevi and Ibn Ezra and Joseph Caro in Toledo.
Yes, look.
I have a client who is a descendant of Joseph Caro, so I'm particularly.
In the case, I would just say that in the case of course, there were two Ibn Ezras. In the case of Moses Ibn Ezra, he writes in Arabic, the great classical work on Hebrew prosody, which unfortunately has never been translated to English. It's been translated into an abbreviated Hebrew translation, and it's been translated into Spanish, but not by my colleague Montserrat Abu Malham at the Complutense in Madrid. But it's a work that is written in Arabic on Hebrew poetry, and of course the great grammars. Again, all of this would be far more than a 1-hour talk, but I wanted to basically set the stage for how this was romanticized by Jewish and by non-Jewish scholars as well.
Right, I've got quite a few raised hands. Can I ask people, if you want a question, can you let us know in the chat, and then I'll look through the chat and I'll filter from there. Raised hand on its own is confusing.
Right. So about Zoroastrians.
Ah,
that
yes,
was the
it's
other
not-
question.
Right, the other, because I went off on Judah Halevi. There was movement back and forth in this, particularly in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, back and forth across the Muslim world. We know a great deal about it, of course, because of the Cairo Geniza, this great cache of over 250,000 documents that were found in the synagogue of Fustat in Old Cairo. The largest single part of which is in Cambridge in the Taylor Schechter collection, but also in London at the British Museum and in libraries all over in Leningrad and in Philadelphia, New York, and so on. And Jews and non-Jews merchants plied the trade across the Mediterranean, and that this included as well there was no large, as far as I know, no large Zoroastrian community in Islamic Spain, but certainly that Iranians came there, that Persians came there, is not the least bit surprising.
Okay, we've got Murad Rosenfeld next.
Murad?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Stillman, for yet again another fascinating talk about this subject. And if I may disclose, if you want to hear Professor Stillman talks about Ibn Gabirol and Yehuda Halevi and all this group of poets, you are most welcome to join us on the 16th of March for the, yeah, we are launching my book.
You beat me to it, Merav.
Excellent. So you're most welcome, not only to hear about these poets, but also to hear about the music itself. We are going to have a very important Chazan from New York, Iraqi Chazan, who is going to demonstrate this song. So we'll have words and music and sounds of Muslim Spain and all the Middle East, actually.
And of course, you'll also have one of the speakers is a real historian of music, Mark Kligman.
Yeah. So
Okay.
you're most welcome.
Okay, Kevin Martin had a question or observation. Kevin, do you want to unmute?
No.
And then the next one, if Kevin isn't unmuting, next one on the list in sequence when they logged in was Lizette Shashua. Lizette, would you like to unmute?
Yep, thank you. I grew up in Iraq, in Baghdad, and at school, we studied Maimonides as Al-Maymun, and he was very well respected, and we had to study part of his poetry. I had no idea he was Jewish. Did he actually practice Judaism openly in Egypt, or was he one of, because you said his family converted to Islam before, did he stay as a Muslim and undercurrent?
No, when the Maimonides family went from Cordoba to Fez in Morocco, and I once was speaking at a program that Chabad had presented on Maimonides, and of course they didn't like the idea that he had converted to. He had to be passing himself off as a Muslim. Remember, to pass yourself off as a Muslim is much easier than as a Christian. All one has to do is say the Shahada, the profession of faith, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, there is no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, and that's it. And indeed, sectarian Muslims, such as the Kharijites, has said a non-Muslim can say it and then can add in, but not for us. And in any case, clearly Maimonides and his father Maimun Hadayan. They to be in Maimonides was I think 13 when the Almohads took over. One of the things they do say in their epistles of comfort is, yes, you can practice Judaism in secret. Pretending to be a Muslim is not a case of idolatry as conversion to Christianity would have been. Remember, they considered Catholicism to be idolatrous because of the images of Christ and the saints and Virgin Mary and so on. But then he said, you should try to get away to a place where you can openly return to Judaism or practice it openly. And the Maimonides family moves from Fez first to the land of Israel, but it's mainly under the Crusaders. They decide not to stay there. After 6 months, they move to Cairo. And from that point on, they are openly practicing Jews. Maimonides almost immediately becomes the Nagid, the head of the Jewish community of Cairo. He doesn't remain in that position, thank goodness, because he would never have had the time to write all that he did. They're openly Jewish, and he and his descendants, his son Avraham ben Harambam, and his grandson David ben Avraham ben Harambam, they become the Nagids of Egypt, and they become great scholars, all of them. His son Abraham, Avraham ben Harambam, becomes the founder of a mystical movement called, like all Jewish mystical movements, Hasidut, and wrote a multi-volume work on Jewish mysticism, and the same with his grandson, his great-grandson. So no, they become a whole dynasty of the Jewish scholars of Egypt.
Well, thank you for that. I know Kevin's mic wasn't working, so he asks the question, when will you be talking about Morocco? And if I can just jump in there and say, we would love to have you back, Noam, and perhaps you would talk about Morocco. We'll have to decide on the exact subject matter, but that would be lovely.
The good news is you've silenced all the audience, no more questions.
There aren't any more questions. So I think on that note, we will wrap up. And I would very much like to thank you on behalf of all our participants for a fascinating talk. Thank you. And I hope you will come back to address us again. And it's just to say to everybody, next week we go to Egypt, when we will be having an event to recall the 65th anniversary of the Suez expulsion, and people will be sharing their memories of that event. So just before we go, I think we will unmute everybody so they can say hello and hello properly to Noam. And thank you once again for joining us for another.
I just have one last question.
Okay.
When does Lynn get the copy of the book with the correct name on it? It's got Norman on the cover.
We'll have to change that. Yeah.
Excellent talk. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Okay, everyone can unmute now. So if everyone wants to say their goodbyes or whatever, everyone can unmute.
Go. Very interesting.
Thank you for a very interesting evening.
Thank you.
תודה רבה, amazing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a
Thank you so much. It was
Thank you very much, and shukran.
If I can add a question, please, about Maimonides again.
Oh gosh.
No, just how come he wrote so much poetry in Arabic. I'm just surprised. And why did they adopt him as one of theirs?
Maimonides wrote everything in Arabic except for his law code, the Mishneh Torah. Everything else is in Arabic, even his answers to legal questions on halakha and so on. And he explains in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah that he's writing it in simple Hebrew so that even women and I'm not selling the product, I'm only describing it. And so that even women and young people can understand the Jewish law. But it also that meant that they could understand Hebrew.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Other than that, everything he wrote was in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 questions.
I think this is becoming a Jewish goodbye.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go on.
Yes.
Yes.
So unfortunately, I joined the lecture a bit later. So first
Show your
question,
video, Alan. Is it Alan?
where can I buy the book of professors? What is the easiest
You
way
can
to
buy
do
them on Amazon.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
There you go.
Do you mind showing this book one more time?
Yes. If you look at my screen, you can see it.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Excellent.
I'll put the names of the books in the chat now.
Uh-huh. And the second question, will you have this lecture recorded?
Yes, yes, we will.
Excellent.
If you are on the Harif mailing list, you will get a link. It'll also be uploaded to the Harif website, www.harif.org.
Excellent. Then may I ask one more thing? My name is Boris, and I live in San Francisco. And my wife and me are sponsors of Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, where we have similar events. Professor, would you kindly consider giving similar lecture to our audience?
Ask, there's a Persian proverb, Pursan Pursan bimaketa khursan. Ask, and you too will get to Mecca.
So how can I contact
you two will get to Mecca?
Well, you can contact me, and with your permission, Noam, I'll give Boris.
You give Boris's details.
Actually, yes, I will give Noam Boris's details.
Fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
It must be getting late in Jerusalem.
Yes, it's getting towards 10:30.
So we'll let you go, Noam.
If you had 2 shots of the vaccine, you're fine for another 2 hours.
No, but I am teaching tomorrow, so.
Yeah, no, we better let you go. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Very much. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov. Leil Menucha.
Tada. Okay.
Fantastic.
I put my email.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Lynn and Julie and Lawrence. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to end the meeting for everyone. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week.